So the kids have succeeded in a number of ways. They've been able to cook a meal for Count Olaf, and they, despite some problems, they did end up serving a meal of spaghetti, and they've also gone to the banker and asked Mr. Poe and tried telling him what was going on with Count Olaf, and they have tried to get him to help them. Obviously, he's now told them that that's Count Olaf is now in charge of them, and he is not going to help them. So what do you think is going to happen next? Let's find out. And Tell Me a Story, a series of unfortunate events, a bad beginning.
Getting a bit late. We might as well just go back and think of something else tomorrow. Perhaps we can stop and see Justice Strauss.
But you said she wouldn't help us.
Not for help, for books.
It is very useful, when one is young, to learn the difference between literally and figuratively. If something happens literally, it actually happens. If something happens figuratively, it feels like it's happening. If you are literally jumping for joy, for instance, it means you are leaping in the air because you are very happy. If you are figuratively jumping for joy, it means you are so happy that you could jump for joy, but are saving your energy for other matters. The Baudelaire orphans walked back to Count Olaf's neighborhood and stopped at the home of Justice Strauss, who welcomed them inside and let them choose books from the library. Violet chose several about mechanical inventions, Klaus chose several about wolves, and Sunny found a book with many pictures of teeth inside. They then went to their room and crowded together on the one bed, reading intently and happily. Figuratively, they escaped from Count Olaf and their miserable existence. They did not literally escape, because they were still in his house and vulnerable to Olaf's evil in loco parentis ways. But by immersing themselves in their favorite reading topics, they felt far away from their predicament, as if they had escaped. In the situation of the orphans, figuratively escaping was not enough, of course, but at the end of a tiring and hopeless day, it would have to do. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny read their books, and in the back of their minds, hoped that soon their figurative escape would eventually turn into a literal one. The next morning, when the children stumbled sleepily from their bedroom into the kitchen, rather than a note from Count Olaf, they found Count Olaf himself.
Good morning, orphans. I have your oatmeal all ready in bowls for you.
The children took seats at the kitchen table and stared nervously into their oatmeal. If you knew Count Olaf, and he suddenly served you a meal, wouldn't you be afraid there was something terrible in it, like poison or ground glass? But instead, Violet, Klaus, and Sunny found that fresh raspberries had been sprinkled on top of each of their portions. The Baudelaire orphans hadn't had raspberries since their parents died, although they were extremely fond of them.
Thank you.
Klaus picked up one of the raspberries and examined it. Perhaps these were poison berries that just looked like delicious ones. Count Olaf, seeing how suspiciously Klaus was looking at the berries, smiled and plucked a berry out of Sonny's bowl. Looking at each of the 3 youngsters, he popped it into his mouth and ate it.
Aren't raspberries delicious? They were my favorite berries when I was your age.
Violet tried to picture Count Olaf as a youngster, but couldn't. His shiny eyes, bony hands, and shadowy smile all seemed to be things only adults possess. Despite her fear of him, however, she took her spoon in her right hand and began to eat her oatmeal. Count Olaf had eaten some, so it probably wasn't poisonous, and anyway she was very hungry. Klaus began to eat too, as did Sonny, who got oatmeal and raspberries all over her face.
I received a phone call yesterday from Mr. Poe. He told me you children had been to see him.
The children exchanged glances. They had hoped their visit would be taken in confidence, a phrase which here means kept a secret between Mr. Poe and themselves, and not blabbed to Count Olaf.
Mr. Poe told me that you appeared to be having some difficulty adjusting to the life I have so graciously provided for you. I'm very sorry to hear that.
The children looked at Count Olaf. His face was very serious, as if he were very sorry to hear that, but his eyes were shiny and bright, the way they are when someone is telling a joke.
Is that so? I'm sorry Mr. Poe bothered you.
I'm glad he did, because I want the 3 of you to feel at home here, now that I am your father.
The children shuddered a little at that, remembering their own kind father, and gazing sadly at the poor substitute now sitting across the table from them.
Lately, I have been very nervous about my performances with the theater troupe, and I'm afraid I may have acted a bit standoffish.
The word standoffish is a wonderful one, but it does not describe Count Olaf's behavior toward the children. It means reluctant to associate with others, and it might describe somebody who, during a party, would stand in a corner and not talk to anyone. It would not describe somebody who provides 1 bed for 3 people to sleep in, forces them to do horrible chores, and strikes them across the face. There are many words for people like that, but standoffish is not one of them. Klaus knew the word standoffish and almost laughed out loud at Olaf's incorrect use of it, but his face still had a bruise on it, so Klaus remained silent.
Therefore, to make you feel a little more at home here, I would like to have you participate in my next play. Perhaps if you took part in the work I do, you would be less likely to run off complaining to Mr. Poe.
In what way would we participate?
Violet was thinking of all the chores they already did for Count Olaf, and was not in the mood to do more.
Well, the play is called The Marvelous Marriage, and it is written by the great playwright Al Funkut. We will give only 1 performance on this Friday night. It is about a man who is very brave and intelligent, played by me. In the finale, he marries the young, beautiful woman he loves in front of a crowd of cheering people. You, Klaus, and you, Sonny, will play some of the cheering people in the crowd.
But we're shorter than most adults. Won't that look strange to the audience?
You will be playing 2 midgets who attend the wedding.
And what will I do? I am very handy with tools, so perhaps I could help you build the set.
Build the set? Heavens, no. A pretty girl like you shouldn't be working backstage.
But I'd like to.
Count Olaf's one eyebrow raised slightly, and the Baudelaire orphans recognized this sign of his anger. But then the eyebrow went down again, as he forced himself to remain calm.
But I have such an important role for you on stage. You are going to play the young woman I marry.
Violet felt her oatmeal and raspberries shift around in her stomach, as if she had just caught the flu. It was bad enough having Count Olaf acting in loco parentis and announcing himself as their father, but to consider this man her husband, even for the purposes of a play, was even more dreadful.
It's a very important role.
Count Olaf's mouth curled up into an unconvincing smile.
Although you have no lines other than "I do," which you will say when Justice Strauss asks you if you will have me.
Justice Strauss? What does she have to do with it?
She has agreed to play the part of the judge.
Behind Count Olaf, one of the eyes painted on the kitchen walls closely watched over each of the Baudelaire children.
I asked Justice Strauss to participate because I wanted to be neighborly, as well as fatherly.
Count Olaf, Father, I'm not sure I'm talented enough to perform professionally. I would hate to disgrace your good name and the name of Al Funkhoot. Plus, I'll be very busy in the next few weeks working on my inventions and learning how to prepare roast beef.
Count Olaf reached out one of his spidery hands and stroked Violet on the chin, looking deep into her eyes.
You will participate in this theatrical performance. I would prefer it if you would participate voluntarily, but as I believe Mr. Poe explained to you, I can order you to participate, and you must obey.
Olaf's sharp and dirty fingernails gently scratched on Violet's chin, and she shivered. The room was very, very quiet, as Olaf finally let go and stood up and left the room without a word. The Baudelaire children listened to his heavy footsteps go up the stairs to the tower they were forbidden to enter.
Well, I guess it won't hurt to be in the play. It seems to be very important to him, and we want to keep on his good side.
But he must be up to something.
You don't think those berries were poison, do you?
No, Olaf is after the fortune we will inherit. Killing us would do him no good.
But what good does it do him to have us be in this stupid play?
I don't know.
Violet stood up and started washing out the oatmeal bowls.
I wish we knew something more about inheritance law. I'll bet Count Olaf has cooked up some plan to get our money, but I don't know what it could be.
I guess we could ask Mr. Poe about it. He knows all those Latin legal phrases.
But Mr. Poe would probably call Count Olaf again, and then he'd know we were on to him. Maybe we should try to talk to Justice Strauss. She's a judge, so she must know all about the law.
But she's also Olaf's neighbor, and she might tell him that we had asked.
Klaus took his glasses off, which he often did when he was thinking hard.
How could we find out about the law without Olaf's knowledge?
Book!
Sonny probably meant, would somebody please wipe my face? But it made Violet and Klaus look at each other. They were both thinking the same thing.
Count Olaf didn't leave us any chores to do, so I suppose we are free to visit Justice Strauss and her library.
Yes, indeed. And you know, today I don't think I'll choose a book on wolves.
Nor I one on mechanical engineering. I think I'd like to read about inheritance law.
Well, let's go. Justice Strauss said we could come over soon, and we don't want to be standoffish.
At the mention of the word that Count Olaf had used so ridiculously, the Baudelaire orphans all laughed. Even Sonny, who of course did not have a very big vocabulary. Swiftly they put away the clean oatmeal bowls in the kitchen cupboards, which watched them with painted eyes. Then the three young people ran next door. Friday, the day of the performance, was only a few days off, and the children wanted to figure out Count Olaf's plan as quickly as possible. There are many, many types of books, and books on tape, and everybody wants to enjoy something different. For instance, people who hate stories in which terrible things happen to small children should turn this audio program off immediately. One type of book that practically no one likes to read is a book about the law. Books about the law are notorious for being very long, very dull, and very difficult to read. This is one reason many lawyers make heaps of money. The money is an incentive. The word incentive here means an offered reward to persuade you to do something you don't want to do. To read long, dull, and difficult books. The Baudelaire children had a slightly different incentive for reading these books, of course. Their incentive was not heaps of money, but preventing Count Olaf from doing something horrible to them in order to get heaps of money. But even with this incentive, getting through the law books in Justice Strauss's private library was a very, very, very hard task.
Oh, goodness! I thought you were interested in mechanical engineering, animals of North America, and teeth. Are you sure you want to read those enormous law books? Even I don't like reading them, and I work in law.
Yes, I find them very interesting, Justice Strauss.
So do I. Violet and I are considering a career in law, so we are fascinated by these books.
Well, Sunny can't possibly be interested. Maybe she'd like to come help me with the gardening.
Lippy!
Which meant I'd much prefer gardening to sitting around watching my siblings struggle through law books.
Well, make sure she doesn't eat any dirt.
Of course. We wouldn't want her to be sick for the big performance.
Violet and Klaus exchanged a look.
Are you excited about the play?
Oh, yes. I've always wanted to perform on stage, ever since I was a little girl. And now Count Olaf has given me the opportunity to live my lifelong dream. Aren't you thrilled to be a part of the theater?
I guess so.
Of course you are.
Klaus passed his younger sister over to Justice Strauss, who left the library with stars in her eyes and Sunny in her hands.
She's stage-struck. She won't believe that Count Olaf is up to something, no matter what.
She wouldn't help us anyway. She's a judge, and she'd just start babbling about in loco parentis like Mr. Poe.
That's why we've got to find a legal reason to stop the performance. Have you found anything in your book yet?
Violet glanced down at a scrap of paper on which she had been taking notes.
Nothing helpful. 50 years ago, there was a woman who left an enormous sum of money to her pet weasel, and none to her 3 sons. The 3 sons tried to prove that the woman was insane, so the money would go to them.
What happened?
I think the weasel died, but I'm not sure. I have to look up some of the words.
I don't think it's going to help us anyway.
Maybe Count Olaf is trying to prove that we are insane, so he'd get the money.
But why would making us be in the marvelous marriage prove we were insane?
I don't know. I'm stuck. Have you found anything?
Around the time of your weasel lady, a group of actors put on a production of Shakespeare's Macbeth, and none of them wore any clothing.
You mean they were all naked on stage?
Only briefly. The police came and shut down the production. I don't think that's very helpful either. It was just pretty interesting to read about.
Maybe Count Olaf isn't up to anything. I'm not interested in performing in his play, but perhaps we're all worked up about nothing. Maybe Count Olaf really is just trying to welcome us into the family.
How can you say that? He struck me across the face.
But there's no way he can get hold of our fortune just by putting us in a play. My eyes are tired from reading these books, Klaus, and they aren't helping us. I'm going to go out and help Justice Strauss in the garden.
Klaus watched his sister leave the library and felt a wave of hopelessness wash over him. The day of the performance was not far off, and he hadn't even figured out what Count Olaf was up to, let alone how to stop him. All his life, Klaus had believed that if you read enough books, you could solve any problem. But now he wasn't so sure.
You there! Count Olaf sent me to look for you. You're to return to the house immediately.
Klaus turned and saw one of the members of Count Olaf's theatre troupe, the one with hooks for hands, standing in the doorway.
What are you doing in this musty old room anyway? Inheritance law and its implications? Why are you reading that?
Why do you think I'm reading it?
The man put one of his terrible hooks on Klaus's shoulder.
I'll tell you what I think. I think you should never be allowed inside this library again, at least until Friday. We don't want a little boy getting big ideas. Now, where is your sister and that hideous baby?
Klaus shrugged the hook off his shoulder.
In the garden. Why don't you go and get them?
The man leaned over until his face was just inches from Klaus's, so close that the man's features flickered into a blur. He breathed out foul steam with every word.
Listen to me very carefully, little boy. The only reason Count Olaf hasn't torn you limb from limb is that he hasn't gotten hold of your money. He allows you to live while he works out his plans. But ask yourself this, you little bookworm. What reason will he have to keep you alive after he has your money? What do you think will happen to you then?
Klaus felt an icy chill go through him as the horrible man spoke. He had never been so terrified in all his life. He found that his arms and legs were shaking uncontrollably, as if he were having some sort of fit. His mouth was making strange sounds, like Sonny always did, as he struggled to find something to say.
When the time comes, I believe Count Olaf just might leave you to me. So if I were you, I'd start acting a little nicer.
The man stood up again and put both his hooks in front of Klaus's face, letting the light from the reading lamps reflect off the wicked-looking devices.
Now, if you will excuse me, I have to fetch your poor orphan siblings.
Klaus felt his body go limp as the hook-handed man left the room, and he wanted to sit there for a moment and catch his breath, but his mind wouldn't let him. This was his last moment in the library, and perhaps his last opportunity to foil Count Olaf's plan, but what to do? Hearing the faint sounds of the hook-handed man talking to Justice Strauss in the garden, Klaus looked frantically around the library for something that could be helpful. Then, just as he heard the man's footsteps heading back his way, Klaus spied one book and quickly grabbed it. He untucked his shirt and put the book inside, hastily retucking it, just as the hook-handed man re-entered the library, escorting Violet and carrying Sonny, who was trying, without success, to bite the man's hooks.
I'm ready to go.
Klaus walked out the door before the man could get a good look at him. He walked quickly ahead of his siblings, hoping that nobody would notice the book-shaped lump in his shirt. Maybe, just maybe, the book Klaus was smuggling could save their lives. Klaus stayed up all night reading, which was normally something he loved to do. Back when his parents were alive, Klaus used to take a flashlight to bed with him and hide under the covers, reading until he couldn't keep his eyes open. Some mornings, his father would come into Klaus's room to wake him up and find him asleep, still clutching his flashlight in one hand and his book in the other. But on this particular night, of course, the circumstances were much different. Klaus stood by the window, squinting as he read his smuggled book by the moonlight that trickled into the room. He occasionally glanced at his sisters. Violet was sleeping fitfully, a word which here means with much tossing and turning, on the lumpy bed, and Sonny had wormed her way into the pile of curtains so that she just looked like a small heap of cloth. Klaus had not told his siblings about the book because he didn't want to give them false hope. He wasn't sure the book would help them out of their dilemma. The book was long and difficult to read, and Klaus became more and more tired as the night wore on. Occasionally his eyes would close. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over. He found himself reading the same sentence over and over, but then he would remember the way the hook hands of Count Olaf's associate had glinted in the library, and would imagine them tearing into his flesh, and he would wake right up and continue reading. He found a small scrap of paper and tore it into strips, which he used to mark significant parts of the book. By the time the light outside grew grey with the approaching dawn, Klaus had found out all he needed to know. His hopes rose along with the sun. Finally, when the first few birds began to sing, Klaus tiptoed to the door of the bedroom and eased it open quietly, careful not to wake the restless Violet or Sunny, who was still hidden in the pile of curtains. Then he went to the kitchen and sat and waited for Count Olaf. He didn't have to wait long before he heard Olaf tromping down the tower stairs. When Count Olaf walked into the kitchen, he saw Klaus sitting at the table and smirked, a word which here means smiled in an unfriendly, phony way.
Hello, orphan. You're up early?
Klaus's heart was beating fast, but he felt calm on the outside, as if he had on a layer of invisible armor.
I've been up all night, reading this book.
He put the book out on the table so Olaf could see it.
It's called Nuptial Law, and I learned many interesting things while reading it.
Count Olaf had taken out a bottle of wine to pour himself some breakfast, but when he saw the book, he stopped and sat down.
The word nuptial means relating to marriage.
I know what the word means. Where did you get that book?
From Justice Strauss's library. But that's not important. What's important is that I have found out your plan.
Count Olaf raised an eyebrow.
Is that so? And what is my plan, you little runt?
Klaus ignored the insult and opened the book to where one of the scraps of paper was marking his place.
The laws of marriage in this community are very simple. The requirements are as follows: the presence of a judge, a statement of I do by both the bride and the groom, and the signing of an explanatory document in the bride's own hand. If my sister says I do and signs a piece of paper while Justice Strauss is in the room, then she is legally married. This play you're putting on shouldn't be called the marvelous marriage. It should be called the menacing marriage. You're not going to marry Violet figuratively. You're going to marry her literally. This play won't be pretend. It will be real and legally binding.
Your sister isn't old enough to get married.
She can get married if she has the permission of her legal guardian, acting in loco parentis. I read that too. You can't fool me.
Why in the world would I want to actually marry your sister? It is true she is very pretty, but a man like myself can acquire any number of beautiful women.
Klaus turned to a different section of nuptial law.
A legal husband has the right to control any money in the possession of his legal wife. You're going to marry my sister to gain control of the Baudelaire fortune. Or at least, that's what you plan to do. But when I show this information to Mr. Poe, your play will not be performed and you will go to jail.
Count Olaf's eyes grew very shiny, but he continued to smirk at Klaus. This was surprising. Klaus had guessed that once he announced what he knew, this dreadful man would have been very angry, even violent. After all, he'd had a furious outburst just because he'd wanted roast beef instead of puttanesca sauce. Surely he'd be even more enraged to have his plan discovered. But Count Olaf just sat there as calmly as if they were discussing the weather.
I guess you've found me out. I suppose you're right. I'll go to prison, and you and the other orphans will go free. Now, why don't you run up to your room and wake your sisters? I'm sure they'll want to know all about your grand victory over my evil ways.
Klaus.
So what do you think is going to happen next? So do you think that Klaus will have, do you think that maybe Count Olaf has another idea in mind, another plan? Is he really not planning on marrying the sister after all? Is Klaus wrong? What do you think is going to happen next? So join us tomorrow at 1:15 and hear a series of unfortunate events, the bad beginning. Goodbye.